Hi, I'm Steve Plaich, and for the next hour, I'll be hosting what I believe to be a very interesting panel discussion about the state of the First Amendment in Santa Cruz. With me this evening are three attorneys who have worked for many years in the defense of civil rights and First Amendment protections in Santa Cruz and Santa Cruz County, and three of the defendants in one of our many court cases that are going on in terms of First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and they'll be giving us their views on the First Amendment as well. I'd like to introduce first Kate Wells, attorney, Robert Norris, local activist, David Bavay, attorney.
Hello.
Local activist Becky Johnson.
Hello.
Attorney Eric Nelson.
Good evening.
And Linda Lemaster, local activist. So I'd like to start with Kate. Kate, just give us a kind of an overview of what you feel is the present state of the First Amendment here in Santa Cruz in terms of the litigation, in terms of the protection of people who are just simply wanting to express their First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of assembly.
I would say that it's a pretty sorry state as we speak. Of course, I'm just coming off of a trial that I prepared for 10 years. It was a pure First Amendment case. I'm sure that many of you have heard about it. The Robert Norris's Nazi salute in a city council meeting, an action that caused absolutely no disruption. However, he was charged with disrupting the meeting and ordered to leave, and when he refused to leave, he was arrested. There's a videotape of the incident that's quite clear that there wasn't a disruption. So and I guess I'll use that case to kind of illustrate what I think is happening at this point in terms of our First Amendment rights. And I'm going to quickly review an old story that I think is important. And it has to do with my son, who is now in his 30s, but this happened to him when he was in high school. And my son was a very outspoken person, and also he thought outside the box. He was a buck the tide for the most part, straight A student. And suddenly we found ourselves in the midst of an expulsion hearing for a bunch of kind of ridiculous trumped up charges, but it became obvious at the hearing that it was his speech that was the issue. And one after another of these school board members sitting up there on high, were chastising him for his speech. He had some teachers there in support of him, but for the most part, the principal and everybody else was trying to get him expelled. And so it came to the very last person on the board, and they looked at my son. He's 16 years old. They looked at my son and they said, "What have you learned by this incident?" And my son paused for a moment and looked the man straight in the eye and said, "I've learned to keep my ideas to myself."
Oh my, yeah.
And I literally wept at that meeting. And I think that it's really an illustration of how public education has pigeonholed people into little compartments. And this was our jury. It was clearly our jury in this trial that all of these people were products of this educational system, all with graduate degrees, all very highly intelligent people, but did not have any clue as to the impact of curtailing our First Amendment rights. Interestingly enough, there were two jurors who held out for a couple of days. And they were the two jurors who were educated outside of the United States.
Interesting.
One was had his PhD from Cambridge, and the other woman as well. So I think that I guess I'd like to lead part of this discussion into a fact that we need to be instilling in our children a respect for the First Amendment and also the encouragement to speak out and to push the envelope and to think outside the box. Because I don't think it's happening, and I think that that's one of the major problems we have.
And I think that's true. Robert, of course, you're a defendant in 2 cases. One, the Santa Cruz Levin case arising from the 75 River Street occupation, and also, of course, the Nazi salute case that Kate alluded to. What have been
Plaintiff in that case.
What have been your impressions of First Amendment rights as they have perhaps even eroded in Santa Cruz?
Well, I do this radio show twice a week, which I've had you on, Steve, before, and other people actually on this panel too. And I'm mostly concerned with the destruction of the survival rights of homeless people, but you can also see the erosion among middle class people. For instance, you yourself and the two of us were discussing the Pruneyard decision's erosion, which it used to be you could give out literature in shopping malls or at least in the parking lots of shopping malls. Now, Trader Joe's will tell you to leave here in Santa Cruz, even if you're an ACLU canvasser. They actually arrested an ACLU canvasser. They dropped the charges before court, but they stopped people from doing that. On Pacific Avenue, you can't have a table for more than an hour. And they stopped Renee Curry, who gives away free food, which is perhaps not free speech in the purest sense, but in another sense, it is a service, and she also does other things with it. It's a religious activity. She was told by police last Sunday, when this is being filmed, today is the 2nd of December, that she had to move along and she couldn't continue to do what she'd been doing for 2 years. So there seems to be a crackdown in Santa Cruz, specifically at the police level. People are being informed about that they don't have rights that they should have, and the police know they have. Even in our libraries, homeless people who use libraries are now going to find themselves probably confronting much more restrictive regulations for behavior. Again, this is not all technically free speech. But the case you mentioned, which Kate was referring to, the issue of, is this the basis for being thrown out of a city council meeting if city council members have been acting repressively and you're trying to convey a quick signal? You don't act like that, you're acting like fascists. And people should be reassured. The courts have held, no, you can't be convicted for this, you can't be thrown out for this. But the real question is, can you get lawyers to defend you once you get thrown out? And I don't know if anybody going to be as generous as David and Kate here in defending a next person who gets thrown out.
And I think one of the questions, of course, you mentioned Renee, that's as much her right to freedom of assembly, and people to assemble downtown, and people to be able to have that kind of right to do that, which seems to be abridged in Santa Cruz. David, you have been a longtime defender of civil rights and First Amendment rights, and of course you're not only defending co-defense counsel with Kate in the Nazi salute case, but also defending Robert and Santa Cruz Levin cases. What has been your observations in terms of First Amendment rights in Santa Cruz?
Well, I'm appalled by the current conditions, and I'm very afraid for the people of Santa Cruz if they step out of line and do anything that disturbs this extraordinarily strict sense of order, both at City Council and in the streets. The streets have always been designated as public fora where maximum First Amendment rights attach. But the issue at the City Council meeting, which, as Kate said, is on video, it's on YouTube. All you have to do is type in Norse Nazi salute, and you can see what happened. And anybody I've ever showed that to has thought that that was totally out of line to arrest him for that. Even the federal judges that heard this case in the Ninth Circuit, 2 of them filed an opinion in which they said all you had to do to know that Robert Norse's rights were violated was to watch that video. You didn't really need any more evidence to decide that his rights were violated, and yet we go to a jury trial in which we put on all kinds of witnesses to say that there was no disruption at that meeting, and a jury comes back, there's 2 courageous jurors that stay as long as they possibly can, but eventually cave to the majority and find that his rights weren't violated, and that sends another signal that tells the city, yeah, you can get away with it, just keep doing this. Do whatever you want because there's nothing to stop you. Lawsuits were the way to stop these things. When you couldn't get the the prosecutors or the public agencies to step in and defend you. You could find a lawyer if you were lucky and go to court and have your rights vindicated in court. And that seems to be less and less likely as time goes on. But I do have a little bit of optimism that this will change, because in American history we've gone through these sorts of oscillations before, where rights were really restricted, and then we had a period when it was more liberalized. And we just happened to be in a very repressive time, and I think we can date it right back to 9/11. I mean, since 9/11, the government has been grabbing power, taking it away from citizens. Everybody wants to be a good German these days, and I think that's what's happening.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. Becky Johnson, you've been a long-time advocate and activist in town, although you certainly don't look old enough to have been.
Yeah.
But I think
Well,
a lot
what
of
they
your
all say.
yes, a lot of your experience has been with singing downtown, with various kinds of activism downtown, and yet you've had experiences where you have had those rights restricted and repressed in certain ways.
Yeah, well, I'd say I was sued by the city for coffee clutching, which was a lobbying effort to get the sleeping ban put on the agenda for the city council. And so 6 months later, we won that case and had that restraining order thrown out as being without merit. But it did tie us up for 6 months and prevent us from being able to fully participate in our government activities. Then I was twice convicted for chalking on a sidewalk. Well, once actually in the gutter, wasn't on a sidewalk. And that was writing messages that, it was a case also selective enforcement where a whole lot of people were chalking, and I just happened to be the one that Julie Hendy of the Redevelopment Agency knew my name, and so I was the only one who was cited, and I ended up being convicted of that.
And now you've had the sing-song cases as well. where you
Convicted
said
of
singing
unreasonably
downtown,
disturbing
doing
noise for
yep.
singing
Downtown.
for about 20 minutes total in a free speech zone in the middle of the afternoon on Pacific Avenue in unamplified sound. One would think that you couldn't be convicted of that, but I certainly was.
And now, more recently, of course, you're a defendant in the Santa Cruz 11 cases.
And in that case, I was holding a sign outside of an action where some other people actually went and opened up an empty bank building and turned it into a community center for 3 days. And now I'm facing 2 felonies: felony conspiracy to vandalize, felony conspiracy to trespass, and then the underlying misdemeanors of trespass and vandalism. By the way, I'm totally against vandalism and have always been against vandalism, but I've been charged with a form of vandalism 3 times now, or I guess, I don't know if you want to count these as separate things here, but
Yeah. Eric Nelson, thanks for joining us. Jonathan Gettleman is Linda Lemaster's lead attorney, but Eric has also been working on Linda's just completed trial in Santa Cruz Superior Court here. Eric, give us your kind of impressions and overview of First Amendment in Santa Cruz.
Well, I'm not as experienced as the rest of my panel here. My most experience has been trying this case with Linda, and fundamentally the case she was cited for lodging on the courthouse steps. And she was engaged in First Amendment speech, and we had a trial, and she was found guilty of factually lodging. But this presents an opportunity on appeal to challenge the constitutionality of the lodging law. First, whether it's vague, or should be void for vagueness, and how it was applied. Because we believe that the police told her, using the lodging law, you must leave or be cited. And that would completely infringe upon her rights. So it'll be interesting to see how this law is used in the future. I can't really say whether her being found guilty gives a benefit or emboldens the police to use this law in the future. It hasn't been used in the past in Santa Cruz, at least. Although I hear it has been throughout California, possibly.
Yes, it has.
Not in Santa Cruz. We'll see where where this takes us with her being found guilty. And hopefully on appeal, she could win the appeal and maybe this could stop this, because there's potential for, to really stem free speech using this law in Santa Cruz.
And Linda, of course, your recently completed trial and regrettably your conviction on 647E lodging. What was your impression of the First Amendment as it was applied in your case and to you personally?
You mean during the trial?
Yeah, and during
It
the
was my
factual,
impression
the
that they
lead up to
buried
it.
it under the courthouse building. When I heard the judge, though it's not fair to synopsize something down to such a composite. I mean, this is where myths are made, but it seemed to me that the First Amendment was excluded. What I was or wasn't doing was excluded. I was told by the judge I wasn't allowed to say any words except yes or no. And Peace Camp 2010, which has long since died, along the way being kicked by the same county deputies that gave me this ticket, did get on trial. But Peace Camp wasn't there to defend itself. It seemed like the DA spent most of the 5 days of that trial that wasn't picking a jury excoriating Peace Camp. So I bet it's got a potent ghost. And so the lodging law hasn't been tested. And in my opinion, which isn't legal, it's far from even rational, but in my opinion, this judge, she seems to be hungry for justice in some sense, but she keeps blocking everything. And at one point I thought she's just in a hurry. Then I had a few other straight thoughts before the trial was out, but she didn't let us finish the demurrer at the very beginning about the law, and yet she referred to it as if it were done, for example, and all the way through the trial was like that, I mean, I'm trying to keep this like a public conversation without a judge
We're
that
all
I may
trying to
have
do
to see
that,
again
sure.
someday.
Well,
But I don't see how the courts can be working if this is what they do with their juries. They snowed this jury and they provoked a bigotry, and they didn't talk about any of the legal issues that we were prepared for, or anything I could find out about the ticket I got more than 2 years before. So I'm just a little upset. It would be the better
David,
answer.
you had just a comment
I
on
just
that?
I just had a reaction to what you just said. You said this was a 5-day trial
Yeah.
plus jury selection?
Well,
Including.
that was the first 2 half days was picking the
Okay,
jury.
so this
Right.
county has wasted 5 days on this case about whether or not you were lodging in a public place. And against the backdrop of these economic times when the courts are barely remaining open because they don't have the resources, the legislator's not giving them money to fund the courts.
Yeah.
And so they have to start making choices about what they're going to prosecute. And they choose to prosecute you.
And that has been the subject of discussion on recent Santa Cruz 11 panels we've had here about the misuse of county funds, about prosecutorial misconduct in that way. But I'd like to move the conversation a little bit toward homelessness. I think we're all in our way have been homeless advocates over time. Many of you are much longer standing than myself. But even through the recent Occupy Santa Cruz and the homeless encampments we've had, we have seen now that they have more of the curfews that they've imposed on the county, arbitrary curfews. They've imposed arbitrary curfews on the levee, arbitrary curfews on the city hall. And on top of all of this, they've layered the homeless sweeps. And these things seem to me to be directly violative of anybody's civil rights and anybody's rights to just peaceably assemble and to try to live and get by. Kate, what are your reactions to those particular things, the curfews and the homeless sweeps?
Well, this actually goes back to a case that came out of San Diego many, many years ago, and I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember the name of the guy. Do you remember?
Eichhorn, Toe.
No. He was an African American man who liked to walk
Oh,
in
Larson.
neighborhoods, in San
Or
Diego,
Lawson.
where where he wasn't welcome, and he would be stopped constantly and ask for ID.
Oh, that's
and
Colander v. Lawson. Okay, there you go. That's the case.
Lawson.
Indeed.
Yeah.
You got
And
it.
this man took this case all by himself in pro per all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. And they eliminated all the loiter laws, which is what the cities had depended on in order to be able to, scurry away people that they didn't want to have in their cities. So they had to get creative about how they were going to do this, and how they have gotten around this is that all of our rights are subject to time, place, and manner restrictions. And if it has to do with the health and safety of the public, or whether or not you're blocking the sidewalk or disturbing other people, I mean, they're just all of these different arrows they now have in their quiver. And the problem is that these didn't start out to be a problem, but they have become emboldened because the Supreme Court has continued to expand this concept of restrictions to the point where now the city of Santa Cruz can tell you that you can only have a political table for an hour, 1 hour. And of course, the places where you can have a political table, I mean, there's only maybe 4 places on the whole mall. And so after an hour, you have to then go and find another place to set up your table. We've been through this with Robert in other cases where they've claimed that he was blocking the sidewalk when that wasn't in fact true. And so what they've done now along the mall is to set up the kiosks and all of these barriers to make it so that it's almost impossible to have any kind of meeting area. The other thing the city did, Santa Cruz did, is that after the earthquake, I think all of us who remember Santa Cruz before remember the Cooper House, which was a gathering place, some place where you could sit, have a glass of wine, and watch street performers and talk and discuss. And it was a wonderful, wonderful place. And there was a conscious effort on the part of the city of Santa Cruz to eliminate, when they rebuilt the downtown, to eliminate any place to meet, any place where people could get together, gather together, and talk and exchange ideas. I think the intent was that if we don't have a place for them to meet, they won't meet. They'll go away. Well, of course they didn't go away, but now, of course, it's bit them in the behind because there isn't any place for them to meet, so they meet in front of the stores. That's the only place there is to meet. And so it was a very failed. If that's what their intent was, they failed miserably.
Robert, you've been a very vocal critic of the curfews, both at City Hall, the levee, the courthouse. Tell us your ideas about the First Amendment impression that seems to indicate.
Well, I think this is based upon the authorities' fear of resistance spurred by actions like Peace Camp 2010 that Linda was just convicted for being present at, and also the Occupy movement that you were sued for last year. And this links, of course, with the homeless situation because the Occupy and Peace Camp 2010 both provided safe places for people to camp and gather and share experiences, store their possessions, things not provided by the Homeless Lack of Services Center, which is the city-funded, they call themselves the Homeless Services Center, but they don't provide the most basic shelter needs, and that's where why you find people in the levee, you find them all over the place. So the various measures being used that you mentioned, Steve, curfews, 647E prosecutions, which is the anti-lodging law, says you can't lodge without defining what lodging is. Just sweeping the mall, going up and down the mall and sweeping the levee telling people things that aren't true, like you have to show us your ID. You're not allowed to loiter here, even though, as Kate says, there's no such thing as a loitering law. You'll see signs that say no loitering in shops. Those are no trespass laws on private property, but on public property, with some very narrow exceptions. There are no current no loitering laws. They just don't exist. But the police are acting as though they are, and you're getting judges colluding with this. I think a couple of years ago they were using stay-away orders. They used something that your colleague, Jonathan Gettleman, was fighting in the case of Leto and Anna Richardson, these two activists or two homeless people that just wanted to be able to be downtown. The authorities wanted to get rid of them. They're adopting new measures to do this. But I think in the main it is generally an attack on a recognition that there's this resistance, the 99% versus the 1%. People are getting wise. They're seeing, their jobs disappearing. They're seeing their homes disappearing. And banks are getting richer, and business for a few people is getting better. And for a lot of people, it's getting worse. And when people resist, this alarms institutional structures, because more important than changing anything, they want to preserve their status quo, even though it's not like they really have that direct an interest in maintaining the 1%'s wealth and power.
David, I wanted to ask you, as we mentioned the sweeps, and of course you're familiar with our recent sweeps of homeless encampments, and there was some notice given and there was some recourse to be able to regain your possessions, but it really impacted more their due process rights and their First Amendment rights. But nevertheless, I think it's an apt topic for discussion here. What's your reaction to and the legality of and the due process violations that might be involved with our homeless sweeps as they're being executed here in Santa Cruz?
Well, there's precedent in a number of cases, and also I think one in Fresno where they did this. They took all the homeless possessions and just threw them away. They're not allowed to do that under state law or under the federal Constitution, which requires that before you take someone's possessions, you have to afford them notice and a hearing, an opportunity to reclaim them.
They're doing it anyway, of course.
And so it's one of those things where unless you take legal action against the government for doing that, nothing's going to happen. So I suppose that needs to happen in Santa Cruz just like it has happened in other places. But the law is clearly established that they're not allowed to do that. So it's one of those things where they do whatever they want without regard to the law, and then somebody has to call them on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one of the reasons why we've had, I think, a particularly active bar in many ways of defending due process violations, defending First Amendment violations. Unfortunately, we kind of got behind the curve on the homeless sweeps. What we should have done initially is to file a temporary restraining order, base it on a violation of due process, base it on a constitutional violation, and said, you may not do this until you can guarantee the due process rights of these folks. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so now we're down the road further where we may be looking at the next sweeps that happen before we can step in and get some legal redress. But I know, Becky, this is something that's of interest to you, and very profoundly so. What's your ideas about homeless sweeps?
Well, I authored a letter from my organization, Huff Homeless United for Friendship and Freedom, and sent it to the various authorities at the Parks and Rec Department, the Police Department, and the City Council about these sweeps. And our position is that these sweeps are an ill use of city funds for people that we cannot offer any shelter to, that there's no place for using these to sweep people out of one area unless we can offer them something. And Huff also further stated that we're not really interested in opening up more shelters for these people. We believe we have sufficient shelters to the extent that we are using them as an emergency entrance place. But what we would like to see is that overflow from these shelters, if it exists, those people be given motel rooms, which we have a glut of empty motel rooms in the winter when the weather is inclement. And there certainly can be a partnership between the Motel Association and the city to buy up blocks of motel rooms so that we can get these people off the streets and into a decent shelter in a humane way. Sweeping them from one area to another area, it's a pointless, it's cruel, it's hurtful, it causes suffering, hardship. People lose their medications, they lose their papers, their ID, their bedding. They're further alienated, isolated. Mm-hmm. And I just saw in the paper today there was an article about a transient problem by the railroad tracks near Beach Street. And Vice Chief Steve Clark says, well, they're there because we kicked them out of the Poganip and Highway 1 and 17 and Grant Street Park. Well, duh.
Yeah.
You know, these people don't go away just because you move them out of some ditch where they're residing.
Well, I think we can all agree that, regrettably, Santa Cruz prides itself on the severity of its ordinances that restrict personal behavior downtown. It's been so since way before my time in town, but I have learned from people who I know and respect that these are extremely strict and extremely limited in what things that people can do. Eric, have you had any reaction to that you can tell us about the various ordinances downtown that restrict people's personal behavior activity?
Well, I don't know if this is a sweep as such, but this came up in the course of Linda's trial. Well, it wasn't allowed to come up. There was evidentiary reasons for why this evidence was kept out of the trial. But during the time of Peace Camp, they cleared the riverbanks. They would cut the grass.
Clear cut them, yeah.
Yes, and this would uproot a lot of people that were finding shelter there. And then a lot of these people went to the courthouse where they were conducting their protests and found shelter there. And then the city then said, well, there was health and safety concerns that became an issue in a way to say that Peace Camp has to stop. I think really Linda could speak on this more, but
Yeah, please, Linda.
Yeah, what would I say? Thanks. I felt like I was there the night I got the ticket because there was somebody there that I felt needed monitoring, and I couldn't find any better way to do it. In court, the judge said to me, you should have called the police. But I was there trying to talk to the police, the sheriff's deputy. And I had tried the day before about the same person's health situation, you know, but she wouldn't let me. Every time I started to say something, she would stop me. So that, it's like this, there's so much clotting, pardon me, I'm a better cook than politician. So much clotting in the discourse that passes for justice in the court, at least in this situation, that you can't really figure out what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you're at the mercy of either your own prejudice or little idioms that the DA might introduce. I mean, it's not a bad idea. And in this trial, to my surprise, and despite all the exposure I've had in the past, the story that did get to unfold in court had to do with YouTube videos
Mm-hmm.
and photographs. And that feels very different. You know? But the point is that they were used to hide the real story. And a big part of it was what Eric was just referring to, that the appropriate response to a sheriff's deputy, if he understood his job and wasn't trying to do his boss's jobs because the board was on vacation and the other departments hadn't quite plugged into each other well enough, let's say, they would have called the health services agency. They would have looked for something that was a solution to what they perceived as the problems. I mean, even a policeman would do that. The sheriff's deputies would know to do that. But in this situation, it had already been politicized. It was a protest. And the people that come and go from court, often citizens with a problem, and the people that work in the county building, no matter what their persuasion, prejudice, or values, they have been calling and calling and calling, and I think they put the sheriff's deputies kind of on the defensive. And they dug into the books. They told us that in court, and they told us that at Peace Camp on the ledge where I got my ticket, that they were looking for something worthy of court, that we could fight. They didn't tell us their real purpose, but it became apparent. It doesn't take a lot of 20/20 hindsight to see that their purpose was to move the demonstration altogether.
And
That means they didn't deal with the health and safety problems any more than they ever have when they swept the levees, when they first liberated the building over at River and Coral Street. The city doesn't understand why they're paying the city planner, it would seem to me. It's like the solution in every political venue that I can see in our county right now to, oh, there's a problem here, people congregating, is to restrict space from public use further. And they closed all the parks long ago. They put curfew at twilight, I think, was the law of the land for a long time. And now they're putting even more restrictions on whether and how you can use them in the daytime. And like some stuff that happened in Florida and some years ago in San Francisco, it's like a Keystone Cops. They're like just coming there to see if they can upset people, you know? So what are you going to do if somebody puts you in a corner? Well, I don't know. I remember Page Smith and his turkey farm. And what happens when turkeys get overcrowded?
So, talking about Peace Camp, I've heard Peace Camp referred to as the original Occupy Santa Cruz, that they were one of the first folks that got together and occupied a space. And of course, in October of last year, there were 300 people that stood up in Nelson Park and committed themselves to social and economic justice, and that became known as Occupy Santa Cruz. And yet, throughout the occupation of the Water Street Courthouse steps and the occupation of San Lorenzo Park, where we actually fed and housed and clothed 100 of our homeless comrades at that point, they, as Linda said, kept restricting our space and restricting our space. And they come in and say, well, you can have a permit if you want, which we didn't want, but we're going to restrict the footprint. We're going to reduce the footprint. And gradually they restricted it down to nothing. Kate, what would be your reaction to that kind of
I want to react, first of all, to a comment you made earlier in terms of the fact that we're now behind the 8 ball, you know, having to do with these sweeps because we didn't take proactive measures. Well, you know, I have to bring this up in terms of the amount of legal help that's available to do something like that. For some reason, our local ACLU has not seen fit to get involved with something like this. You know, I've been doing this for 30 years, and as a result of this, I lost my home 2 years ago, and I'm living on the edge of homelessness on a regular basis here. It's expensive to mount that kind of an injunctive relief action. And I think we need to work really hard to shame some of these organizations that should be standing up for their, the civil rights of everybody, not just those people that are high profile, not just those issues that are high profile, but really, and I know there's some blockage of that by people who are on the city council having a loud voice and wanting to keep things the way they are, and but I still think that we need some way to finance these actions.
Yes, and of course, I do agree, and I do think that our local ACLU, of which I'm vice chair, as you know, really needs to take the lead on this. And believe me, that we have been splashing water against that rock, at least I have, for some time. And at some point, we may actually get them to be proactively involved, and not retroactively saying, gosh, we should have stood up and done something. We had a problem during Occupy when we were trying to get some help for various legal things we had going on from the National Lawyers Guild. And they would tell us, well, we have some lawyers in San Francisco, and there's something going on in San Jose, but nothing down here. And the ACLU, and I'm not proud to say that they will always say, well, we have lawyers that are working in Northern California, and we have people here, but we don't have anybody for you down here. Now, certainly I don't believe that's the case, and certainly you don't believe that's the case, but at some point that will change, and it has to change, and I think you're exactly right for pointing that out. But let's just go around once. I want to get your opinion about the Occupy movement and its initiatives for social and economic justice, because it's really important to us and important to people in the audience, I think, to really hear your views on that.
Well, I guess that what I'd like to use is the Occupy movement in terms of the abandoned bank building that was occupied locally.
75 River Street.
Yes, and I guess that somehow we have lost total perspective over who's the real criminal here. I mean, really, what has Wells Fargo Bank done to us and to millions and millions of people? And here, a small group of people go in and use this as a little community center, and they're suddenly being criminally prosecuted for felony felonies. I mean, it's just insane. I feel like I'm living in some kind of alternative universe here.
Right.
You know, I mean, we need to gain this perspective of, wait a minute, who is the real criminal here?
And let me hasten to point out that one of the things that Occupy has been able to do is do good work on foreclosure. The Occupy Foreclosure Working Group, with Joy Hens is here, some other folks have done great work and continue to do great work in that, and so I think that's worth noting.
In response to that, 75 River Street, Wells Fargo has a lease on that. It costs $35,790 a month to lease that building.
To keep
You
it
know?
vacant.
Multiply that times 12, because it's every month, and you get up in, it's something, we're around $422,000 a year. Then Wells Fargo puts that in their portfolio as a paper asset worth that amount. The Fed says that they have to keep 10% on hand and they can lend out against that. So that $422,000 per year is multiplied times 10. And those loans are Wells Fargo is loaning that money, that paper money, the ones and zeros they put in their computer that they never had any money in the first place. And they're lending that to you and me and getting interest on that money too. There is no money, people. That's why 75 River Street will never be rented to a tenant, because they're making so much money off of that piece of property, and they're only paying $40,000 a year in property taxes.
Well, many say that the criminals really weren't at 75 River, they were across the street at 74. But
That's for sure.
let
What
me,
happened to
let-
the
yeah,
city
let
standing up for our
Let me
rights?
ask Robert, you've been outspoken on Wells Fargo banks in general, that kind of economic justice that we really should be considering and working on and be aware of. Give me your views on that.
Well, you know, I wish I had more expertise on the actual behaviors of Wells Fargo Bank in this county. That's something that I think the Occupy movement hasn't really done much research on. I find myself more interested in other subjects, even though I'm in the middle of this legal case where we're facing 7 years in prison for 2 felonies and 2 misdemeanors. I mean, other groups have done more. In San Francisco, as you know, Steve, the assessor's office has found that almost every majority of the loans that Wells Fargo has been engaged in are, if not illegal, improper in some way. Whether they involve this, this kind of mixture of mortgage reevaluation at the same time as the
The defects and chains of title, things of that nature.
things of that sort as well. And so the real issue has to do with the maldistribution of power and wealth, both in terms of Wells Fargo as a bank and other large institutions. But it's really I think as I was saying before, the anxiety of the institutions that the sheriffs, the police department that felt that was embarrassed that a bunch of people did go in into Wells Fargo and took over the building for 3 days and then left of their own accord under threat from the police, but they didn't do it because they were dragged out. They did it to avoid that sort of thing. Yeah. And in response, instead of letting the issue go or even going after the people that they can show engaged in some kind of graffiti or vandalism, they go after high-profile activists who have been engaged in First Amendment struggles in this community.
And critics.
What's that?
Critics.
Yeah, and critics of existing government and governmental figures like Mayor Don Lane or Mayor soon-to-be Hillary Bryant. So I wish I had better answers for your actual questions. See, maybe other people here do.
And
Wells
what you're
Fargo,
saying, I think, is apt. And when you're saying about the misapplication of economic incentives and balance, stuff like
we
that.
need information about what's happening with Wells Fargo in
David
this
spoke to
county.
it earlier about all the money that they're spending on these Santa Cruz 11 prosecutions. All that money being misapplied, not to economic justice or even criminal justice for that matter, but simply at the whim of our district attorney. And you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the inability to look at the total picture. And we have a situation in our country where inequality of income and inequality of economic opportunity has never been worse than it is now. This is the worst it's been. We have a great taxation system for people who are making money because they invested dollars rather than actually work to earn the money. We punish people for working for money and give people breaks if the money is sitting in some kind of investment. But the big problem right now is we have all of this vacant housing, and we have all of these homeless people.
Tremendous amount of which is
And-
right here in Santa Cruz.
Yes, and in our country, private property is the paramount value. And no matter how irresponsible you may be about how you manage your property, or some bank holding on to just a huge inventory of properties they're doing nothing with, the last thing you want to do is meet a social need by using that property that's not being used by anybody else. Europe is far ahead of us on this. In Europe, if you see a vacant property and it's been vacant for a year, you can move into it. Nobody's going to bother you as long as the owner doesn't come back within a certain amount of time. It's kind of an adverse possession deal. And you're expected to fix the property up, you're expected to pay the taxes on it, or whatever else might be required. Why do we just let the situation sit like this? Why don't we let people who are motivated move into these homes
Well, absolutely. Here,
and protect the neighborhood against deterioration from the vacancies? And that's not happening here, but there's a movement to do it. There actually is a movement now started to take over these properties and
More
let people
felonies?
who need them use them.
That's just the repurposing of vacant space, Robert. But I
Exactly.
know that Linda, let me ask you this, you have been outspoken and written about the inequality of economic distribution and whatnot.
Yeah, I wrote a Occupy-related article that also touches on the way I feel Santa Cruz 11 were set up. Basically, it's like the police department invited the citizenry and whoever watches the evening news to play vigilante and call up with names of people they might be able to pursue. And they did. And it doesn't have anything to do with police work.
Yeah.
And it also talks about a little bit of a trend of the homelessness here, because no matter what else changes civically, because it's always a withdrawing or a lessening or a prohibiting of the concourse or the public spaces, it's always generating greater homelessness and greater suffering for those that are already homeless.
Right.
That's our social policy. I believe it's the nation's social policy. I believe all the cities that I can see are doing the same thing. Santa Cruz just kind of had a head start because they started before Reaganomics was done, slicing all the mental hospitals open. Santa Cruz was saying, well, since the people here think that homeless people come here because we got better goodies here, let's make sure we have the rottenest goodies. And that's been the civic policy ever since. That's the underpinning to any other stuff we try to develop to make a family shelter or whatever, get the veterans off the street or whatever thing that either the federal government dictates every few years or that we see when we are awake as a community is needed. And we go after these things, but we never go out of the bedrock, which is this policy of grinding people out of the fabric of society. And we need to. And in the meanwhile, I think we should take the money from all the city planners and just throw it up in the air. We'll get more for it. I really do.
Now, Eric, I don't know whether you've done any work as a public defender. I know Jonathan has done some. He's on that panel. But that's another example here in Santa Cruz where all the public defender hours, David, you were saying all the court hours, all the clerk hours, all the bailiff hours, all of that money being spent on prosecutions for people who are simply trying to promote their particular feelings of social economic justice. And what's your view of that?
Well, you don't have to be a lawyer or an experienced activist to see that. I mean, in our jury pool, people, ordinary citizens are like, really? Are we really here for this? Like, you're wasting my time, the court's time. People are saying, don't believe in sitting here and trying to prosecute her for lodging. And, a lot of those people would have been made great jurists, at least in favor of Linda, possibly. But they were so outspoken and so aghast at, one, the money, and two, the charges, and they managed to remove themselves from being part of the jury through that. But it was the feeling that was the feeling of the whole jury pool. And these are just a cross section of Santa Cruz County residents.
Let me ask you, we will go around again. I think we're getting near the end of our time, but Kate, you've been here for many years. You've done so much great work in terms of defending First Amendment rights. What has been your feeling about the willingness of law enforcement generally to cede any kind of First Amendment rights or any kind of liberties to the citizenry?
I see it as having started out, at least when I started out, as being very, very low, and it's probably much lower now. It's only gone the other way, and this is fortified by a lot of, like I said, a conservative U.S. Supreme Court that has continued to expand governmental powers over the people. And whether it's 9/11, I don't know. I think it was starting to happen before that, but no, I don't see any encouragement. I don't understand why some of them just don't say stop. I didn't hire on the Santa Cruz Police Department to be kicking homeless people in the butt at night because they've fallen asleep. Where is the integrity?
Right.
I just think, how embarrassing that is what you've come to represent, is somebody who is kicking somebody who's already about as low as they can get.
Yeah.
So I don't see it happening, it's a source of great concern for me that there isn't at least a minority voice that's willing to stand up and say, wait, this is not right, and I'm not willing to do these sorts of things.
Robert, you've done a lot of cop watch over time. You've certainly had a lot of uneven relationships with our local law enforcement, and yet you have talked to many of them. And what's your general sense of their doing their job within the local ordinances and yet ceding at least some liberty to their citizens?
Well, it's hard to get police officers on my radio show. I do get interviews.
We had hoped to get a couple on the show this evening. But,
Chief Vogel yesterday at the Homelessness Summit wouldn't even talk to me, and Vice Chief Clark was making snide comments about me. But it's getting, I think, I tend to agree, unfortunately, with Kate. Some people look back upon, the 70s and 80s here in Santa Cruz as a halcyon days. They weren't halcyon days. People were being killed by the police department at that time in the Code Blue killings, beaten and killed. They were never convicted of it, but they were fired, and the head of the police department was dumped, and they got the new group in, which was in some ways better, but not substantially better.
4 police officers were convicted.
Yeah, no, they weren't convicted. They were fired. I wish they were convicted. They didn't.
They used the Nuremberg defense. Basically, none of them were convicted. But
That's shocking.
they pretty much admitted doing it and said that we were instructed to do so.
You have the crippling of all police review agencies in Santa Cruz. They were crippled before the court decisions, the state court decision, not the federal courts, decided that police officers didn't have to be. Investigations were closed completely because they were administrative matters, which ended open police investigations by citizen groups into police stuff. You can still do that, but you can't appoint a government body to do that because of the so-called Copley decision. But Santa Cruz killed its police department and its police review board in 2003 and appointed a powerless police auditor. We don't have any review of the police department here. We have instead this growing dangerous phenomena of vigilante police cooperation, where police are using the drug war, needles, trash, sketchy homeless people become something that is blamed for petty crime, which is a concern of people in the neighborhoods. They don't want their cars broken into, they don't want their homes, they feel unsafe. The needle exchange, as you know, Steve, was defunded 3 or 4 years ago, and so now people, and there is no realistic policy to deal with the drug war. You need to have injection centers, inhalation centers.
Sure.
You need the medicalization
Okay, let's,
of the
we've
drug
got
war.
about 4 minutes. I'd like to get 30 seconds or so from each of everybody, starting with Linda. Just in your sense of what personal liberty is in Santa Cruz.
What it
First-
actually is
yeah.
for people in general?
Yeah.
Well, my perspective is one that's been here for over 30 years. And things are so compromised beyond just civil and human rights and civil liberties. You look at the schools, you look at what a kid got to do if they went to a public school 15 years ago and what they don't get now in the regular Orthodox public schools. And this is how we're raising our town.
Yeah.
That when those kids get out of high school, there's no job for them locally.
Okay.
Unless they want to compete with the college students to be paid too little to support themselves.
Eric, just 30 seconds on personal liberty in Santa Cruz.
Well, I'd say there's a lot of not conflicting, but competing interests. And the people with a stronger voice, their interests are going to be heard. And that's going to leave other people without a voice, without liberties.
Well said, even though we are the 99%.
Yes.
Becky?
Well, if we don't have the right to peaceably assemble and seek redress of government grievances and to speak our mind, especially to dissent, then we don't have the tools to affect government abuse or misuse of funds or anything. So those are things that we really have lost a lot of ground on, and really we have to continue that fight.
Okay, thank you. David?
Well, I don't live here, but when I see what goes on here, I worry a lot about this becoming the template for these things to be extended to other communities. So I think it's really important that it stop here. And the only way it's going to stop is to put pressure on the city to pay some attention to constituencies other than the moneyed class and the merchant class.
Thank you, David. Robert, a few words?
I think people have got to stand up and help each other in this matter when on the streets, when police officers are being abusive or even interrogating people, because a lot of this is going on, particularly homeless people, or when private citizens are running around with video cameras harassing homeless people. Instead of going after the city officials, should be cleaning up the trash.
Kate, you've got our last 30 seconds here.
Okay, I think that there needs to be first of all, an education, there needs to be public education. Most people I talk to have no idea we have a blanket ban in Santa Cruz. And I think people are always shocked.
Yeah.
I was instructing my homeless clients to wear them as ponchos. And you want to talk about the cops and how they're dealing with this? They would rip them right off their heads as evidence. So people are dying of hypothermia because we can't cover ourselves with a blanket at night. How mean, how cruel is this?
I want to thank all of our panelists, Kate, Robert, David, Becky, Eric, and Linda. This has been a wonderful discussion about the First Amendment in Santa Cruz, such as it is today. But really, thank you so much for being here. It's been a fascinating hour, and we hope to continue this discussion as we go forward. Thanks very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.